Hello and welcome to today's video. My name is Elian Gomez, and today I have a presentation for you about changes to the DSM-5. And I think it's going to be very useful and very interesting for you, especially if you're doing the NCE exam soon and you want to know more about the DSM-5. I'm going to also talk a little bit about the evolution from the first to the fifth. And well, the DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and already the text revision appeared in March 2022, so this year. I'm not going to talk so much about it, just at the end I'm going to give a little bit of information about it. But first, of course, I'm going to talk about the major changes, minor changes, and some criticism to the DSM-5. So hopefully it's useful for you. Okay. So in terms of history, well, we know that this is a very important tool that psychiatrists have been using for a long time. And now, of course, also psychologists and counselors should know as much as possible about it. It started in 1940s, called Medical 203, and the name DSM started in the 1950s. It was a small book of 130 pages. Then it was revised and they created new terminology, new symptomatology that was important. And in 68 appeared the second edition, DSM-2. Homosexuality was removed as a disorder by voting because many experts were starting to be more open-minded about homosexuality and remove it. And that was only happening in 1974. And then in 1980, the new version appeared, DSM-3, and that was the multi-axial version that continued until DSM-4. That's something I'm going to talk about. That was a major change in DSM-5. And then, we have DSM-3 revised in 1987, DSM-4 in 1994, and the revision, the text was done in 2000. The one that we're still using now is DSM-5 from 2013. There's a lot of criticism, so we're going to talk about those at the end. And as I said before, in 2022, just in March, the text revision appeared for this as well. So something important is to know what is a DSM and what is not. So the DSM is a diagnosis and classification tool. It helps communication among professionals. And of course, for coding and billing, it's also very useful, and even for research purposes. We shouldn't take it as a Bible, because it's just a tool, and it is sometimes some of the descriptions could be mistaken or could be based on cultural values of the time or the people that decide to write about these disorders. So it's not static, it's always evolving. The diagnoses are always evolving. And it's not a guide to select the appropriate treatment. It's just to give you all the tools needed for diagnosis. Okay. Also, in terms of the changes, so one of the major changes is related to the multi-axial terminology that was used before, and now there's no more axis. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this axis. So before, this multi-axial version was had 5 axes. The first one was like really related to the psychiatric disorders. The second one was personality disorders. The third one was medical problems that could have some symptomatology similar to medical disorders, but were an axis on their own. The fourth one was related to social and contextual elements, but they were also considered an axis. And the fifth one was related to how the World Health Organization would define their codes. But now the first 3 became the main diagnosis. The fourth one, it's the psychosocial and contextual factors, which could appear and will influence any of the diagnosis. And the fifth axis, it's, as I said before, the World Health Organization Disability Assessment Schedule. So there are no more access. Something else that changed is the NOS and not otherwise specified. Now it's only considered other disorder or unspecified disorder. Also, some of the codes change. Coded diagnosable conditions like 374 changed to 324, and others also changed. Something else that changed was the number of V codes. They listed only 22 in the DSM-4, and now there's 88 V codes. In terms of abuse, explicating abuse, there used to be only 5 codes, and now there's 44 codes. So these are other major changes. And in terms of the diagnosis, as I said, some of the conceptualizations change. Also, some categories change. And in the case of, in general, how the disorders were first diagnosed in infancy, childhood, and adolescence, now that category was dropped. And for example, neurocognitive disorders before in the DSM-4 were separated in delirium, dementia, and amnestic or other cognitive disorders, and now they're all put together into neurocognitive disorders, all for elderly people, or I mean, they could be presented earlier. Then the mood disorders in the DSM-5 are now separated into 2 categories, so the bipolar and related disorders and depressive disorders. They changed them. Before there were only 1 category. Sexual and gender identity disorders are now 3 types. So we have now sexual dysfunction, gender dysphoria, and paraphilic disorders. Then the eating disorders are also now feeding and eating disorders, and both they were considered in infancy, and early adolescence. They became 1 category. And impulse control disorders, they're no more in the DSM-5. They're not classified anymore like that. Now there's disruptive, impulsive disorder, and conduct disorder. Then the somatoform disorders also changed name into somatic symptoms and related disorders. The adjustment D and acute stress disorder were removed from anxiety disorder, and now they have their own category, and they're part of the trauma and stress related disorders. Factitious disorders was dropped, and factitious D is just put under somatic symptom disorders. And pervasive developmental disorder, it was also renamed. Now it's autism spectrum disorder. Also Asperger is there, and others. I'm going to talk a little more about those because they're part of the next category, that is the neurodevelopmental disorders. And just to finish this section, neurodevelopmental disorders didn't exist before as a category. Also, obsessive compulsive related disorders was part of anxiety, and now it's a category on its own. Also, trauma and stress related disorders, as I mentioned before, now it's a category on its own that didn't exist before. Elimination disorders didn't exist either. Elimination includes ecopercent and anorexia. And there's also another category that's called other mental disorders and medication-induced movement disorders and other adverse effects of medication that were not there before. So these are the major changes. So within the neurodevelopmental disorders, as I said, this pervasive developmental disorder was the main category, but it had also autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, and childhood disintegrative disorder. Now they all are 1 disorder that is called autism spectrum disorder. It's a spectrum, so it's including all of those. Social communication disorders are now in the DSM-5, but they were not before. There's no equivalent. And red disorder was in the DSM-4, but not anymore. Mental retardation changed names to intellectual disability, a little more nuance-free and less discriminatory. Then the reading disorder changed into being called dyslexia. Mathematics disorders is now dyscalculia. Disorders of written expression and learning disorders, not otherwise specified, now they're unspecified learning disorders. And expressive language disorder I'm sorry, I'm in the way. Let's see if I can move myself a little bit. Okay. So the language disorders, now there are language impairment, late language emergence, and specific language impairment. And the mixed receptive expressive language disorders, there's no more equivalent for in the DSM-5. Phonological disorder became speech sound disorder, and stuttering became childhood onset fluency disorder. Another changes in the dissociative disorders, not otherwise specified, that neither either dissociative identity disorder or other specified dissociative disorder. Also, the other one, the realization without this personalization, change into depersonalization and or derealization disorder of its own. Dissociative disorder with unclear symptoms became unspecified dissociative disorder. And well, those are the major changes, and some minor ones that I mentioned as well. And well, what are the criticisms? There's many, but let's focus on some of them that are very specific. For example, in the time that the DSM-5 was published, 11,000 health professionals didn't want it to be published. They thought that they had weak evidence for some of the disorders and their symptomatology. They thought they had too many labels. They thought that some of the symptoms that included, for example, behaviors in normal range or just mild eccentricity, like shyness, shouldn't be called a disorder. And they thought there was a lot of referral to psychiatric drugs than before. So those are criticisms that we should take into consideration. Now the text revision in 2022 considers some things. For example, it includes revised text and new references, clarifications and diagnostic criteria, updates to the ICD-10-CM codes, and it features a new disorder, prolonged grief disorder. Now it's considered in the DSM-5 TR. And in terms of the ICD-10-CM codes for suicidal behavior and non-suicidal self-injury, now they exist before they were not there. So these are the major changes, and this new edition, DSM-5 TR, will probably soon be there in the exam as well for the NCE. For the moment, don't worry about DSM-5 TR. Just study the changes in the DSM-5. Hope this video was useful, and have a nice day. Bye-bye.